Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome to another journey into the quiet mysteries of village life. Tonight, as the fire flickers and the kettle hums softly, we find ourselves in Willowbrook, a village dusted with frost and festooned with holly, where the scent of freshly baked scones mingles with the crisp winter air. Our story is titled The One-Eyed Widow's Final Clue, a tale of subtle intrigue, whispered secrets, and an unexpected discovery that will keep your mind turning. Tell me, where are you listening from this evening? The night had all the trimmings of a perfect English winter evening. The air was sharp with frost, the kind that nipped the cheeks and painted the breath in little puffs of silver. From the tower of St. Hilda's, the bells chimed softly, their notes drifting across rooftops dusted with white. Along the narrow lanes of Willowbrook, lanterns glowed golden, guiding villagers toward the church hall where laughter and merriment spilled into the night. Inside, the fete was a tapestry of familiar comforts: seed cake dusted with sugar, mulled cider steaming in cups, knitted scarves folded neatly beside baskets of preserves. Friends greeted one another with warmth. Yet beneath the cheer there lingered a current of curiosity, for where Mrs. Honoria Blackwell appeared, interest always followed. The widow stood at the center, her jeweled eye patch catching the light like a restless star. Her fortune, her sharp remarks, and her hidden dealings had made her both feared and admired. But when the raffle tickets were drawn, gaiety gave way to shock. Mrs. Blackwell crumpled without a sound, the winning ticket drifting from her hand. Gasps rang out. Heart failure, some murmured. Poison, others whispered. Chapter 1. Gossip Beneath the Lanterns. Morning came to Willowbrook wrapped in a thin shawl of mist, the rooftops still white with frost from the night before. The bells of St. Hilda's struck 9, echoing across the cobbles, and one by one the villagers emerged from their snug cottages. Some came with baskets on their arms bound for the bakery, others with letters to post, but all carried the same intent: to discuss the shocking events of the fete. The bakery, with its wide front windows and the scent of fresh loaves spilling out onto the lane, became the first forum of opinion. Mrs. Turner, round-faced and rosy from her ovens, leaned over the counter to whisper to Mrs. Hale, the dressmaker. It was her heart, poor soul. You could see she hadn't been well for weeks. Too proud to admit it, of course, but that's how these wealthy ones are. Mrs. Hale pursed her lips, tying her parcels with neat knots. Her heart? Perhaps. But I heard the doctor was not at all certain. Said it was sudden, too sudden. And I must say, I never trusted that mulled cider she insisted on serving. Bitter, wasn't it? Had the taste of something foreign. Behind them, a younger voice chimed in. Lucy Perkins, the vicar's niece, who had slipped in to buy a bun. Mama says it was poison. She says there was spite in the air, and Mrs. Blackwell had enemies enough to fill the hall. She giggled nervously, but the sound drew frowns. Not far away, in the corner near the rack of currant loaves, Miss Margaret Ellison adjusted her spectacles and folded her gloved hands atop her shopping basket. She was a neat figure, neither tall nor imposing, but with a presence that drew confidences as surely as the post office drew letters. She did not interrupt the flow of chatter, nor did she offer her own theories. Instead, she watched, her blue-gray eyes noting not merely the words but the tones in which they were spoken. Mrs. Turner's insistence carried the warmth of sympathy, but Mrs. Hale's sharper suggestion held the relish of someone enjoying the drama a little too much. At the post office, the scene repeated itself. Villagers queued with letters clutched in mittened hands, yet their tongues were occupied less with stamps and more with speculation. Mr. Griggs, the retired schoolmaster, declared in booming tones that Mrs. Blackwell had been cursed since her husband's death. An unnatural life she led, keeping secrets, keeping books no one was allowed to see. It's no wonder the Lord called her suddenly. In reply, young Martha, who sorted the letters behind the counter, whispered to a friend, "But what about her nephew? Didn't anyone notice how flushed he was last night? Quarreling with her. He was. It looked fierce to me." The clamor of voices rose and fell like the tide, but Miss Ellison remained silent, her gaze fixed on a notice pinned to the wall, though her ears missed nothing. She knew well that gossip was not idle in a village. It was evidence, if sifted with care. A contradiction here, an embellishment there, and suddenly a pattern emerged. As she stepped outside into the crisp air once more, the sound of whispers seemed to follow her like the tolling of a bell. To some, the widow had died of frailty, to others by treachery. Yet Miss Ellison knew that truth often nestled quietly between extremes, waiting for someone with patience enough to uncover it. And somewhere in those hushed voices lay the first thread of the mystery, tugging, beckoning her forward. By late morning, the whole of Willowbrook seemed steeped in recollection. The church fete, once remembered for sugared cakes and knitted mufflers, was now retold in 100 different shades of suspicion. Where loaves and letters had been the currency of gossip earlier, it was money and family now, for Mrs. Blackwell's fortune had always been the jewel around which speculation circled. At the apothecary, Mrs. Webb leaned heavily on her cane, confiding to anyone who would listen. "It's her money that did it, mark my words. Too many cousins, too many hangers-on. I heard she promised him a share, then took it away again. Nothing sets a family to quarrel like inheritance." Her eyes narrowed meaningfully at the cluster of women who nodded in return. Mr. Jameson, the grocer, added in his slow, deliberate way, "Her nephew Thomas was red as a beetroot last night. Stormed out into the snow halfway through the raffle. He did. Said he'd had enough of her insults. I'd wager there's more in that quarrel than the price of ticket." He shook his head, setting the scales clinking. But another villager, Mrs. Abbott, was quick to contradict him. No, Mr. Jameson, you've misremembered. It wasn't Thomas who stormed out. It was her companion, Miss Rowe. Thin as a rail and sour as vinegar, that one. She muttered something about being made a fool before she banged the door. I saw it myself. Miss Ellison, who had come in to purchase a jar of marmalade, listened quietly as the accounts piled one atop another. The details shifted like sand with each retelling, but within them she noted a curious pattern. Mr. Jameson had placed Thomas at the center of conflict, while Mrs. Abbott shifted suspicion to Miss Rowe. Yet both agreed upon the same thing. A quarrel, fierce enough to leave tempers smoldering, had taken place. As she left the grocer's shop, her steps carried her down the lane toward the vicarage, where more villagers clustered. There, old Mr. Phelps, the bell ringer, wagged a crooked finger. She always kept her kin at arm's length, that one. Never forgave slights, never forgot insults. They say she cut her own sister out of the will. And as for the nephew, well, she threatened him with disinheritance more times than I can count. It was while this chorus of memory and resentment swirled that a quieter voice tugged at Miss Ellison's ear. Mary Finch, the Blackwell maid, stood pale and hesitant, as though reluctant to speak. "I shouldn't tell it," she murmured, her hands twisting at her apron. "But I heard her, ma'am. Day before the fete, it was, when she thought no one was near. She raised her voice something dreadful. Said she'd ruin him if he crossed her again. I couldn't see who she spoke to, but her words, oh, they chilled me." Miss Ellison inclined her head gently, her expression one of patient encouragement, though her heart beat a little quicker. For in that timid confession lay something sharper than gossip, the ring of genuine menace. A quarrel could be dismissed as family squabbling, but a threat, a threat spoke of motives darker and more deliberate. As the church bell tolled noon above them, Miss Ellison considered the puzzle unfolding piece by piece. Mrs. Blackwell had left more than a jeweled eye patch and a fortune behind. She had left a trail of grudges, and grudges, as she well knew, could prove deadly. Chapter 2. Candles and Early Clues. The afternoon sun broke briefly through the clouds, spilling a pale light across the frosted gravestones in St. Hilda's churchyard. Inside the vicarage, however, the fire burned cheerfully, and the smell of beeswax polish lingered in the air. The Reverend Mr. Lyle, a kindly man with thinning hair and spectacles that slid perpetually down his nose, sat at his desk with a curious object before him. A ledger, bound in green leather, its corners worn and its pages filled with Mrs. Blackwell's neat, angular hand. He had come into possession of it quite by chance, or so he explained when Miss Ellison called upon him with a basket of scones. It was among the effects she had asked me to safeguard, he told her, adjusting his spectacles. Odd thing to entrust to a clergyman, you might say. If she gave it over only last week, saying I should keep it safe until, well, she said no more, merely gave me that piercing look of hers. Miss Ellison accepted her tea and set her basket aside, her eyes drawn at once to the ledger. The vicar leafed through the pages, shaking his head. Household accounts, for the most part, servants' wages, coal deliveries, the grocer, the dressmaker. But here and there, look, strange entries, initials only, with sums far larger than any ordinary expense. J.T., for instance, appearing month after month. And once, here it is, R.M., with a figure that would have kept half the parish in meat and candles for a year. Miss Ellison leaned closer, her gaze sharp though her manner remained mild. The handwriting of the ordinary expenses marched across the pages with precision, but these curious initials were written differently, slightly heavier strokes, a faint tremor in the letters, as though Mrs. Blackwell had pressed too hard or hesitated before setting them down. "Have you any notion who these initials might represent?" she asked quietly. The vicar shook his head. "None at all. I have racked my memory. No villager I know bears those initials. Could it be a solicitor in town, or a physician perhaps? Yet why so secretive?" Miss Ellison turned a page, tracing the pattern with her fingertip. The payments to J.T. were regular, always at the close of the month, while the R.M. entry appeared only once, and in a larger hand, as though written with unusual emphasis. She noted, too, that the ink was slightly different, darker, perhaps fresher. "Curious," she murmured. "Curious indeed. Did she ever mention a visitor, perhaps someone from outside the parish?" "Only that she received callers in the afternoons," the vicar admitted. "She was not one for company otherwise. She told me once that business matters demanded her attention, though she would not elaborate." He closed the ledger with a sigh. "It troubles me, Miss Ellison." She seemed almost relieved when I took it, as though a weight had been shifted from her shoulders. Miss Ellison sat back, her thoughts knitting together. A ledger could reveal much, if one knew how to read between the lines. Money, after all, often spoke louder than words. She considered the initials again, the tremor in the pen, the secrecy of it all. If Mrs. Blackwell had been paying someone regularly, what was she buying? Silence? Loyalty? Or perhaps concealment of a truth she dared not face in daylight? As the fire popped in the grate, Miss Ellison folded her hands serenely. "Thank you, Mr. Lyle. You have shown me more than you think. Let us keep this between ourselves for the time being." Yet even as she spoke, she knew the widow's ledger had opened a new path in the mystery, one marked not by whispers or quarrels, but by figures and ink, and by a hidden visitor whose shadow now fell across the village. The Blackwell house stood at the edge of the village, a grander structure than most, with ivy clinging stubbornly to its stone walls and windows that seemed to peer down upon passers-by like watchful eyes. It was here on a crisp afternoon that Miss Ellison found herself welcomed by Mrs. Blackwell's housemaid, Clara, a nervous girl with hands reddened from endless scrubbing and a voice that quavered whenever she spoke of her late mistress. "Beg pardon, miss," Clara began as she ushered Miss Ellison into the parlor, its curtains drawn against the chill. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and old roses, but beneath it lingered something sharper, almost metallic. Clara's fingers twisted the hem of her apron. "There's something I ought to tell, though I don't know if it's of importance. Last evening, when I was clearing the tea things, I dropped one of the cups. Lady's best porcelain it was. She'd been drinking from it not long before. When it shattered, I thought I'd be dismissed on the spot." Miss Ellison regarded her with calm encouragement. "And yet you weren't." Clara shook her head. She didn't seem to notice. She was pacing the room, muttering to herself. I swept up the pieces quickly, but the girl's brow furrowed as she searched for words. There was a smell. Bitter, sharp, not like tea at all. More like almonds, if you please, though not sweet, not natural. The description caught Miss Ellison's attention like a pinprick. She asked softly, "Did you keep any of the fragments?" Clara hesitated, then opened a small drawer in the sideboard. Wrapped in a rag lay 2 pieces of porcelain, still faintly stained. Miss Ellison bent over them, lifting the fragment carefully to her nose. The faint, acrid tang lingered, unmistakable even after a day. She set it down, her expression composed, though her thoughts grew steadily sharper. "Did anyone else see the cup?" she inquired. "Only Mrs. Blackwell herself," Clara replied. "She told me she'd pour her own tea, which was odd. She never did before. Said she wanted to be left in peace." The girl shivered. Her hands trembled when she set the cup down. Miss Ellison filed this quietly among the other impressions of the day. The ledger with its mysterious initials, the quarrels whispered in shops, and now a cup with a faint trace of bitterness clinging to its broken rim. All pointed towards something deliberate, something prepared with care. That evening, she carried the fragments to Dr. Fletcher, the village physician, whose little surgery smelled of camphor and herbs. He adjusted his spectacles as she explained, and then examined the porcelain, sniffing delicately before leaning back with a grave expression. "You're not mistaken, Miss Ellison," he said. "There's an odor here, faint but unmistakable. I cannot declare with certainty, but it resembles substances I'd rather not find in a teacup." "Poison?" "Yes, not impossible." His words settled heavily in the lamplight. Miss Ellison thanked him with her usual gentle composure, but inside, the quiet certainty of her suspicion deepened. If the widow's death had not been natural, then someone had sat across from her, smiling perhaps, as the bitter taste mingled with the tea. Someone within their small circle had chosen deceit over honesty, malice over peace. And in Willowbrook, where every face was familiar, the thought was colder than the frost outside. Chapter 3. The Wrong Suspect. The Green Man Inn, with its low-timbered ceilings and the smell of wood smoke clinging to its beams, was the favored gathering place of Willowbrook's menfolk, and, on that particular evening, of a fair number of women as well. Word of Mrs. Blackwell's sudden death had rippled through the village like stones cast into a still pond, and by the time dusk fell, speculation bubbled as freely as the cider poured from the tap. At the corner table, a cluster of villagers leaned close, voices rising above the crackle of the hearth. "It's Thomas Pritchard, sure as I stand here," declared Mr. Barnes, the butcher, a stout man whose cheeks flushed with indignation. "I saw him with my own eyes, standing in the lane outside her house, shouting like the devil himself. Red in the face, fists clenched. And this was no more than 2 nights past. Mrs. Carter, the innkeeper's wife, nodded vigorously, her apron swishing as she bustled about with mugs. And didn't she cut him off from her will? Everyone knows he'd been expecting a tidy sum. And when she told him no, well, it near broke him. Another voice chimed in. Young Peter, the blacksmith's apprentice. I heard she told him he was a wastrel, not fit to inherit a brass button, let alone her fortune. He stormed away, swearing she'd regret it. Miss Ellison sat quietly at a small table nearby, knitting in her lap, though the needles clicked more slowly than usual. Her eyes, mild behind her spectacles, took in the expressions, the tones, the relish with which each tale grew bolder. In the village, stories never shrank. They swelled, fed by fear and the secret thrill of scandal. Mark my words, Mr. Barnes continued, slapping his palm against the table for emphasis. The lad's temper will be his undoing. Poison's a coward's weapon. Aye, but sometimes anger makes cowards of men. Miss Ellison raised her gaze, her voice gentle as she interjected. And you are quite sure, Mr. Barnes, that you saw him threaten her? Words can often be mistaken in the heat of the moment. The butcher frowned, his certainty wavering under her calm scrutiny. Well, perhaps I did not hear every word. But his manner, miss, his manner spoke volumes. A ripple of agreement followed, though tinged with unease. It was easy, Miss Ellison knew, for a community to seize upon an obvious culprit, particularly one as hot-tempered and outspoken as Thomas Pritchard. His quarrels with his aunt were no secret. He wore his grievances as plainly as his mud-spattered boots. Yet something in the accusations felt too neat, too convenient. Poison required patience, calculation, subtlety. It was not the weapon of a young man, known more for rash words than cunning plans. The door creaked open just then, and a hush fell as Thomas himself entered the inn. His hair was unkempt, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He strode to the bar, demanded a drink, and stood with his back to the room, shoulders rigid. Every eye followed him, whispers circling like sparrows in a restless flock. Miss Ellison's knitting needles stilled. She studied him quietly, the tense jaw, the tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass. Angry? Certainly. Foolish? Quite possibly. But guilty? That, she thought, was another matter entirely. For in the heart of gossip, truth often slipped away like smoke from the hearth, leaving only the illusion of substance. And Miss Ellison, with her unerring patience, was not one to be misled by smoke. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the frost clinging stubbornly to the hedgerows as though reluctant to yield to the sun. Miss Ellison, wrapped in her sensible wool coat and carrying her ever-present knitting bag, made her way along the lane toward the smithy. She had resolved that Thomas Pritchard's guilt must be measured by more than tavern talk and raised voices. Gossip, she reflected, was a poor judge. It could condemn a man before truth even had its boots laced. Thomas was hammering at the anvil when she arrived, each strike resounding with more force than seemed necessary. His temper, she thought, was like the iron before him, raw and heated, shaped by pressure. He glanced up, startled, and tried to school his features into indifference. "You've been much spoken of, Mr. Pritchard," Miss Ellison remarked gently. "And not kindly, I fear. Yet stories are not facts. It is where you were, and with whom, that matters most." For a moment he looked ready to flare, then deflated with a sigh. "I was at the Cartwrights that evening, fetching timber for repairs. Ask him if you like. And after that, I went to the Cooper farm. James Cooper needed help with his mare. She foaled just before midnight." Miss Ellison inclined her head, and later that day, she did precisely as he suggested. Both the Cartwright and James Cooper corroborated his words, each adding small, telling details. The timber load weighed down his cart at dusk. The mare's birth was witnessed by half the Cooper household. The timeline, though inconvenient for his critics, cleared him neatly from suspicion during the hour of Mrs. Blackwell's collapse. And yet, his nerves were another matter entirely. Even when acquitted by fact, Thomas seemed unable to stand easy. His hand fidgeted at his side. His gaze darted when pressed with questions, as though concealing something not criminal but deeply uncomfortable. Miss Ellison observed him in silence, her mild eyes far sharper than he realized. "The truth," she said softly, "is not always about guilt, Mr. Pritchard. Sometimes it is about what weighs upon the heart." He swallowed hard, but before he could answer, fate intervened in the most curious of ways. While searching his coat pocket for a scrap of paper, some proof of his alibi, he insisted, he drew out an altogether different fragment. It was small, torn, and crumpled, yet unmistakable, a piece of a pale pink raffle ticket, edges ragged as though ripped in haste. The room fell silent. Miss Ellison held it delicately between her gloved fingers, her expression unreadable. The very tickets that had been clutched in Mrs. Blackwell's hand at the moment of her collapse. Thomas paled, his lips parting in shock. I don't know how that came to be there," he stammered. Miss Ellison, calm as ever, tucked the fragment into her handkerchief. "No doubt, Mr. Pritchard," she said in her most even tone, "there is an explanation. The only question is, will you tell it before someone else does?" And with that, the neat fabric of his alibi, so carefully stitched, now bore a jagged tear, one that begged for mending or unraveling. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Hearthlight. The vicarage at Willowbrook stood modestly beneath a mantle of ivy, its chimneys sending up the faintest curls of smoke into the frosty afternoon. Miss Ellison walked the gravel path with quiet purpose, her boots crunching in rhythm to the church bell's half-hour chime. She had received a note from Reverend Alton requesting a private word. The hand that penned it had wavered, and she suspected the weight of conscience pressed heavily upon him. Inside, the study was as she remembered, rows of well-thumbed books, the faint fragrance of beeswax polish, and a fire glowing steadily in the hearth. Reverend Alton rose from his desk, his expression solemn yet tinged with relief, as though at last he might lay down a burden too long carried. "Miss Ellison," he began, after she had settled herself into a high-backed chair, "I find myself in a position most uncomfortable. What I am about to confide may appear a betrayal of trust, yet circumstances compel me." He clasped his hands, the knuckles widening. "Mrs. Blackwell came to me, some 3 weeks past, in great agitation." Miss Ellison inclined her head, her needles clicking softly as if to set a pace for his halting words. "She spoke," he continued, "of being blackmailed. The person she did not name, but she feared exposure of something she called her old sin. She begged me, quite desperately, for counsel. I urged her to place the matter in God's hands, to have courage and, if possible, confide in the authorities. But she recoiled at the thought. She insisted that scandal, any public stain upon her name, would be worse than the blackmail itself. His voice faltered, and he turned his gaze to the fire. She was a proud woman, Miss Ellison. Proud, and not without reason. But fear corrodes pride more swiftly than rust eats iron. I cannot help but believe her death may be tied to that secret." Miss Ellison regarded him thoughtfully. "And this old sin, Reverend, did she offer any hint of its nature?" The vicar shook his head slowly. "Only that it lay in the past, and if revealed, it would destroy the respect she commanded in this village. Beyond that, she would say no more." The fire crackled, filling the silence. Shadows leapt upon the shelves, as though books themselves strained to overhear. Miss Ellison, ever gentle, asked, "And since that day, did she return to you?" He sighed deeply. "Once, last Thursday, she was resigned. She said the matter had grown more pressing, that the sum demanded had doubled. Her last words to me were, 'I would rather die than have it spoken aloud.'" Miss Ellison's needles paused mid-stitch. That chilling phrase lingered like smoke in the room. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and laid a hand upon the vicar's desk with quiet firmness. "You have done rightly, Reverend, in speaking now. Whatever the cost to her memory, the truth may save the living." He met her gaze, gratitude softening his troubled eyes. Yet beneath his relief lurked another unspoken question. If Mrs. Blackwell had feared blackmail so deeply, who in Willowbrook held the rope that tightened around her throat? Miss Ellison left the vicarage with the dusk settling purple across the fields, her thoughts darkened by that unholy bargain. Somewhere, in this peaceful village, someone had profited from the widow's shame, and perhaps silenced her forever. The solicitor's office in Willowbrook occupied a narrow brick building on the high street, its windows perpetually misted in winter, and its rooms steeped in the faint odor of ink and leather. Miss Ellison had always found such places curiously revealing, where villagers spoke in half-truths and glances. Paper and ink recorded the things people seldom dared utter aloud. Mr. Henry Godfrey, a precise man with wire spectacles and cuffs starched to rigidity, received her with a grave bow. "I had not intended to speak until the coroner had finished his work," he admitted, ushering her into the cramped office. "But news travels swiftly in Willowbrook, and secrecy is seldom a lasting friend. Perhaps it is best that you know." He unlocked a drawer and withdrew a parchment-bound document, its edges already curling. "Mrs. Blackwell visited me only a fortnight ago. She drafted a new will. The contents, I fear, will not sit comfortably with certain members of her family." Miss Ellison's brows lifted ever so slightly, though her hands remained composed on her lap. Indeed, she had resolved to disinherit her nephew, Thomas Pritchard, Godfrey said, voice taut with the weight of revelation. Instead, the bulk of her estate was to pass to her companion and maid, Margaret Hale. The remainder, in smaller bequests, to the church and a charitable trust in Bath. It was as if a chill wind had passed through the little office. To disinherit the nephew so openly, and to favor a servant, was no small matter in a village where pride and property marched hand in hand. Mr. Godfrey polished his spectacles as though to steady his own nerves. She was most insistent, spoke of betrayal, though she did not name its source. I advised her that such a document would stir resentment, but she dismissed my caution with a sharpness I have seldom heard. She said, "Better the resentment of the living than the triumph of the undeserving." Those were her words. Miss Ellison allowed herself a faint, thoughtful hum. "And did she sign it?" "She did. Witnessed and sealed." Yet he hesitated, drawing out the document. "When I reviewed it this morning, I found something most troubling. One page is missing, the final sheet, where her signature was set beside the terms concerning her investments." He laid the will before her. The parchment bore the familiar hand of Mrs. Blackwell, brisk, slanted, impatient. But where the last page ought to have been, there was only the ragged edge of torn binding. "I keep my papers under lock and key," Godfrey insisted, his fingers drumming the desk. "Yet here it is, incomplete. A will without its final page is a shadow of itself, no better than gossip. Without it, the document may be contested, or worse, dismissed outright." Miss Ellison traced the torn edge with a gloved finger, her mind whirring quietly behind her calm expression. Somewhere between Mrs. Blackwell's final visit and this moment, someone had meddled. Someone who knew the power a single page could wield. Wealth, inheritance, security, and scandal, all hinging on a signature. She rose, offering the solicitor a nod of gratitude. "You have shown me a window into her last intentions, Mr. Godfrey, and perhaps, unwittingly, into the heart of her death." As she stepped back into the dusky street, the church bell told the hour. A missing page, a missing truth. Whoever held it might very well hold the key to the entire mystery. Chapter 5. The Shadow in the Snow. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, muffling the village in a white hush that seemed almost reverent. Willowbrook's cottages, hedges, and rooftops all lay under a clean, glistening sheet, as though the world itself wished to cover over the ugliness of suspicion. Yet Snow, Miss Ellison reflected as she walked up the lane toward Mrs. Blackwell's house, was a poor accomplice in concealment. It betrayed more than it hid. The widow's garden stood stark in the morning light, the rose bushes hunched beneath frosted caps, the gate creaking faintly when stirred by the wind. Constable Briggs, a good-hearted man with more appetite than aptitude, had been stationed there, stamping his boots for warmth. "Morning, Miss Ellison," he greeted, lifting his cap. "Not much to see, though folks still keep wandering by." But Miss Ellison's sharp eyes were not so easily deterred. She paused, looking down at the snow between the garden path and the lane. There, clear as ink upon a blank page, ran a line of footprints, neat impressions of boots, cutting across the whiteness with undeniable purpose. "Strange," she murmured. "These were made after the fall, not before. Do you see how the snow still rims the edges? Fresh, within the hour." Briggs frowned. But Mrs. Blackwell collapsed in the church hall. Not here. No one should have come or gone from this house since last evening. "Should," Miss Ellison replied softly, "is a dangerous word in such matters. The snow tells us what was, not what ought to be." She followed the prints carefully, her steps measured. They led from the back door of the widow's house, down the garden path, and out through the small gate to the lane. Beyond, the trail forked. One set carried on toward the village, while another circled back, as though the walker had changed their mind halfway. Miss Ellison bent to examine the impressions more closely. Boots of middling size. A man's, likely, though not large. The heel is worn unevenly. They do not belong to Thomas Pritchard. His stride is heavier. She straightened slowly, her breath rising in pale clouds. And whoever it was did not wish to be seen entering by the front. Briggs scratched his head. But why come here at all, if Mrs. Blackwell wasn't home? She'd been at the fete all evening. Miss Ellison's needles clicked softly from her bag, a habit when she thought. Unless she returned, briefly, before her collapse. Or unless someone wished to fetch something from her house, something worth risking discovery for. Briggs looked alarmed. "You think the place has been broken into?" She shook her head gently. "Not broken. Entered. By one who knew the Keys place, or had one of their own." The footprints tugged at her thoughts with quiet insistence. They did not merely contradict the comfortable tale of Mrs. Blackwell leaving her house for the fete and never returning. They suggested a secret interlude, a hidden meeting, or a theft concealed beneath the cheer of lantern light. As Miss Ellison turned back toward the house, her gaze settled on the garden gate once more, its latch faintly dusted with snow where a gloved hand had brushed it. Whoever had come and gone had done so with calm certainty, as though accustomed to the path. "Constable," she said softly, her eyes narrowing with quiet resolve, "the dead are not the only ones who leave traces. It is the living we must read most carefully." And in that white silence, the trail seemed almost to beckon her onward, a mystery inscribed upon the snow, waiting for eyes keen enough to follow it. The widow's drawing room remained exactly as it had been left after the constables concluded their cursory inspection. The fire still laid, though long cold, the curtains drawn stiffly against the winter sun, and the faintest trace of mulled wine lingering in the air. Miss Ellison entered with deliberate calm, her knitting bag looped neatly over her arm, eyes scanning the chamber as one might read a page already familiar, yet worth revisiting. On the mahogany sideboard stood a neat arrangement of decanters, glasses, and a silver tray, the sort of display that spoke more of appearances than genuine hospitality. Yet one detail unsettled the tableau. Among the row of wine glasses, all faintly clouded by use or neglect, one gleamed too brightly, polished to a clarity almost unnatural. Miss Ellison's gaze lingered on it. A single glass, spotless, placed back among its duller kin as though hoping to escape notice. She reached out, her gloved fingers brushing its rim. The surface bore no smudge, no speck of dust. Too careful, she thought, as though someone had not merely cleaned it but erased it. At that moment, Margaret Hale, the late widow's maid, entered with a tray of kindling for the hearth. "Beg pardon, miss," she murmured, setting it down. Her eyes flickered briefly to the sideboard. No more than a second, but enough to betray awareness. Miss Ellison, mild as ever, smiled. "I was just admiring Mrs. Blackwell's glassware." She was a woman particular in her tastes. Margaret gave a small nod, her hands tightening on her apron. "Yes, miss. She liked things tidy." Yet Miss Ellison recalled the vicar's words of blackmail, the solicitor's tale of the new will, and now this curious attempt at concealment. Tidiness alone did not explain why one glass shone with such unnatural perfection. Later, she inquired discreetly of Constable Briggs, who had access to the drawing room during the fete preparations. "Why, the maid, of course," Briggs replied. "And Mrs. Blackwell herself?" "Naturally. The vicar came by to collect her. And her nephew. He stopped here briefly before heading to the inn. But all that's proper enough." Miss Ellison gave a slight hum, the kind that carried more thought than sound. A glass polished so carefully might once have contained more than wine. Bitter residue, perhaps, like that found upon the shards of the broken teacup. The thought made the fireless room feel colder still. She studied the arrangement again. Every other glass bore the faint blur of fingerprints, the ghost of use. Only this one gleamed as though it had never been touched, or touched, and then erased with nervous precision. And she thought of Margaret, whose eyes had flickered, whose hands had trembled. A maid inheriting the estate, if the solicitors could be trusted. A maid who knew the house better than anyone else, who could enter and depart without raising alarm. Miss Ellison's needles clicked faintly as she drew her thoughts together. "Too careful," she murmured under her breath. "When care becomes overcare, it ceases to be innocence." From beyond the frosted window panes, the church bells tolled the hour, their sound heavy with foreboding. For the first time, suspicion crept not toward a quarrelsome nephew or some shadowy blackmailer, but toward the woman who had stood loyally at Mrs. Blackwell's side. And Miss Ellison, with her quiet, watchful eyes, wondered whether loyalty had masked something altogether darker. Chapter 6. The Net Draws Tighter. The vicarage parlor had seldom seen such company gathered at once. Its walls, lined with shelves of old sermons and hymnals, now bore witness to the uneasy stirrings of human conscience. Reverend Alton, though kindly, seemed faintly bewildered by the turn of events. He had agreed readily enough when Miss Ellison suggested a simple tea for those most intimately connected to Mrs. Blackwell, but he had not anticipated the undercurrent of tension that now flowed beneath the room's polite surface. The table had been laid with an immaculate white cloth, scones set out in a neat pyramid, and the vicar's best china glinting faintly in the candlelight. It was not tea or pastries that preoccupied the guests. They came because Miss Ellison had invited them, and one did not lightly refuse her summons, however gently phrased. Thomas Pritchard, the nephew, shifted in his chair as though the seat were too narrow for his restless frame. His eyes darted toward the window, then back again, and his fingers tapped a rhythm against his knee. Margaret Hale, the maid, sat with folded hands, her lips pressed tight as though to prevent words from slipping out unbidden. The solicitor, Mr. Godfrey, polished his spectacles with unusual vigor, while the doctor sipped tea too quickly, as if the hot liquid might scald away his unease. Miss Ellison herself occupied a modest chair by the fire, her knitting needles flashing with calm, unhurried precision. She asked no direct questions at first. Instead, she coaxed conversation as one might coax a shy bird, letting it flutter from one branch to another. "Strange, how swiftly winter has drawn in," she observed mildly. "Do you not find, Mr. Pritchard, that the smithy fire seems doubly welcome these days?" Thomas grunted, color rising in his cheeks. "Aye, though I've little rest to enjoy it." His fingers tapped faster. "And Margaret," Miss Ellison continued, "you must have had your hands full these past weeks, caring for Mrs. Blackwell during the season's demands." The maid glanced down, smoothing her apron. "Yes, miss. She was particular in her ways." Her voice trembled on the last word, as though it concealed more than fatigue. Mr. Godfrey interjected abruptly. "Particular, indeed. She made her opinions felt to all, even in her final days. It is a wonder she found time for charity amid her strong convictions." His handkerchief squeaked against his spectacles, betraying agitation. The doctor coughed, nearly spilling his tea. "We must not speak ill of the dead," he said hastily, though his eyes flickered toward the sideboard where the untouched wine glass had been found. Miss Ellison's needles clicked, the sound gentle yet inexorable, like a clock marking time. She did not accuse, nor did she press. Instead, she allowed silence to bloom after each remark, a silence in which fidgeting hands, darting eyes, and swallowed words revealed more than testimony ever could. The vicar, attempting cheer, offered more scones, but no one reached for them. Each guest sat imprisoned by their own nerves, every gesture a thread in the net Miss Ellison was patiently weaving. At last, she looked up, her expression one of mild curiosity. "It is a curious thing," she said softly, "how the truth will make itself known, even when we try to bury it beneath courtesy. A single word, a glance, a silence, all are more eloquent than speeches. Do you not think so?" Her gaze swept the room, touching each face in turn. No one answered, but their unease was answer enough. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow deepened, and inside the vicarage parlor, the net drew tighter, strand by strand, as the truth prepared to emerge. The atmosphere in the vicarage parlor had grown dense, as though the very air carried the weight of secrets pressing to be spoken. Tea sat cooling in porcelain cups, the scones untouched, while the fire threw long shadows across the carpet. Each guest, though outwardly composed, was gripped by the tension Miss Ellison's quiet presence seemed to cultivate. Then, with the same serene composure that had accompanied her knitting, she reached into her reticule and withdrew a small folded envelope. The room seemed to still at once. "I have here," she said mildly, "something rather curious. It came to me in pieces, scraps, one might say, swept aside as though of no consequence. But one finds that even trifles, when fitted together with patience, may reveal their story." She opened the envelope and drew out a slip of paper. Though mended with delicate care, the inked number upon it was clear enough. It was a raffle ticket, the very one believed missing from the fate's draw. A murmur ran through the company. Mr. Godfrey leaned forward, his spectacles catching the firelight. Margaret Hale's hands clenched tight in her lap. The doctor's eyes widened, while Thomas Pritchard let out a sharp exclamation. "That," Thomas began, his voice cracking. "That cannot be. I had no part in it." Miss Ellison gave him a kindly glance. "Indeed, Mr. Pritchard, I know you did not. The fragments were not found among your belongings, but elsewhere, somewhere they ought never to have been." She let her gaze drift, pausing not on Thomas, but on another face. The silence that followed was charged, like the hush before a storm breaks. "You see," she continued, "the raffle's fairness was of great importance to Mrs. Blackwell. She trusted that all should be in order. Yet someone thought to tamper with the draw, to conceal the rightful ticket, and thus alter the prize's destination. That act, my friends, is not merely petty mischief, but a thread woven into a darker design." Her fingers smoothed the fragile ticket as she spoke. What struck me most was its placement. It was not discarded with rubbish, as one might expect of a thing meant to vanish. Instead, it was hidden in a place accessible only to one person, a place that bespoke fear and calculation and, I dare say, guilt. Margaret gasped faintly. The doctor shifted in his chair, his face pale. Mr. Godfrey's hand shook as he set down his cup with a faint clatter. Miss Ellison went on, her tone never rising, though each word seemed to strike more heavily than the last. "When one considers the footprints in the snow, the polished glass on the sideboard, and now this," she held the ticket aloft, "the pattern becomes, to my mind, unmistakable. Each piece alone may appear trivial, but together they form a picture, and that picture points with clarity to the hand that tampered with the raffle and, I believe, with Mrs. Blackwell's very life." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks upward. No one moved. All eyes were fixed upon the small, mended ticket that fluttered lightly in Miss Ellison's hand, as if such a fragile scrap could bear the weight of justice itself. Then, in the tense hush, someone gave a strangled cry, half protest, half despair. Gasps followed, a ripple of realization passing through the room as the guilty party's identity dawned on every face. Miss Ellison lowered the ticket onto the vicar's table with calm finality. The net she had drawn was closed, and the truth, at last, was cornered. Chapter 7. The Unmasking at Willowbrook. The hush that followed the cry in the vicarage parlor seemed endless, as though the very walls of the old house were holding their breath. Miss Ellison, seated primly with her knitting bag at her side, did not raise her voice. Instead, she spoke in the same gentle cadence she might use when remarking upon the weather. And yet every syllable carried with it the gravity of revelation. "My friends," she began, "it was no sudden seizure that claimed poor Mrs. Blackwell at the fate, nor was it the frailty of her heart. What ended her life was a substance, subtle, bitter, and carefully chosen. A poison slipped in her cup at the very moment she raised it to toast the drawing of the raffle." The vicar stirred, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Margaret Hale pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Thomas Pritchard, red-faced and restless, muttered a curse under his breath. Miss Ellison's eyes, pale and unassuming, traveled round the company. The means, you see, lay in the very cheer of the occasion. The villagers were served mulled cider, cordial, and wine, each poured freely. Yet one glass stood apart, polished so meticulously it bore no trace of use. To the untrained eye, it was a kindness. To mine, it spoke of concealment. A murmur of agreement rose, quickly hushed. She continued, The substance was introduced not openly, but under cover of familiarity, masked by the sweetness of cordial. A bitter tang was noticed by the maid who swept the broken cup, though she did not recognize it. To Mrs. Blackwell, intent upon the raffle and her victory, the taste was but a fleeting oddity. Within minutes, however, the effect was fatal. She let that sink in before her voice softened further. But motive, dear friends, is the true compass in such matters. Why should anyone wish to silence Mrs. Blackwell? She was not beloved, it is true, but neither was she wholly despised. Yet she held in her possession the power to ruin, for she was privy to secrets, and it was her habit to wield them as one might a whip. Here Miss Ellison folded her hands neatly in her lap. Mrs. Blackwell had recently sought the counsel of the vicar. She feared exposure of what she termed her old sin. I believe she meant not her own misdeeds, but another's, a misdeed she had discovered and threatened to bring to light. Thus, the motive was not gain of fortune, though that too played its part, but fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of the quiet destruction of reputation. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. Envy also sharpened the edge. Miss Ellison continued. For Mrs. Blackwell, with her jewels and her sharp tongue, inspired a peculiar mixture of fascination and resentment. To some, she represented all that was unattainable, wealth, defiance, and independence. To others, she was a menace, capable of stripping away respectability with a single careless word. Such a woman, standing at the heart of a small village, becomes both admired and hated. And when admiration curdles into envy, and envy festers in a deadly course may be taken. Her gaze lingered at last upon the one who had cried out moments before. That face was ashen now, the hands trembling visibly. It is in the smallest of details that truth resides, Miss Ellison concluded, her voice as calm as ever. The footprints at the garden gate, the polished glass, the torn ticket, each a whisper pointing toward the same hand. And behind that hand lay a heart consumed by envy and by fear of exposure. That, my friends, is the true explanation of how the widow met her end. The silence that followed was deeper than before, heavy with the knowledge that the mask of innocence was slipping and the true face of guilt stood revealed in the hearthlight. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The clock on the mantel ticked in measured strokes, each second heavy as a bell toll. Then Miss Ellison inclined her head, her voice carrying the weight of quiet certainty. "It was not Thomas Pritchard," she said, her words cutting cleanly through the silence. "Though his temper made him a convenient scapegoat, his heart is hot, not calculating. No, the hand that felled Mrs. Blackwell was one far gentler to the eye, and therefore more insidious. It was her trusted companion, Miss Margaret Hale." A collective gasp burst from the company. The vicar recoiled as though struck. Thomas leapt to his feet in disbelief. Margaret? No. She cared for Aunt Honoria as though she were her own flesh. Miss Ellison's knitting needles clicked once as she set them aside. Precisely so, Mr. Pritchard. She cared, but not as wholly as she wished us to believe. For Mrs. Blackwell had drawn up a new will, one which cast Miss Hale aside. Years of dutiful service, of tending to the widow's household, of enduring her sharp tongue, were to be rewarded with nothing. Instead, the inheritance would pass to another branch of the family. A humiliation and a peril, for Miss Hale's livelihood depended on her place under that roof. Margaret's lips parted, though no words came. Her hands clutched the arms of her chair, knuckles white against the polished wood. "The evidence," Miss Ellison went on softly, "was never in shouts or quarrels. It lay in the polish of a glass. wiped so clean as to betray its very purpose. It lay in the footprints outside the garden gate, set in fresh snow at the hour Miss Hale claimed she was within. And it lay, most damning of all, in the raffle ticket, for its fragments, pieced together, bore not the mark of chance, but of design. Miss Hale sought to draw her own number, to secure the prize that might offer a measure of independence. When Mrs. Blackwell discovered the tampering, she threatened exposure. The fire snapped sharply, and Margaret flinched as though the spark had burned her. She could not risk it. Miss Ellison continued, her tone never rising. Exposure meant disgrace, loss of place, perhaps even prison. And so, envy joined hands with fear. The poison, prepared quietly in advance, was slipped into the cordial Mrs. Blackwell favored. All was done with the soft step and patient hand of one accustomed to being overlooked. The room seemed to draw in upon itself. The villagers stared at Margaret, their faces caught between pity and horror. At last, she spoke, her voice breaking like thin glass. She would have ruined me. Everything I had, gone with a word. You cannot know what it was like living under her rule, knowing I was to be cast aside like an old shawl. I only wanted what I had earned. The vicar bowed his head, tears bright upon his lashes. Margaret, child, better to have faced hardship than to stain your soul so. But Thomas, ever blunt, muttered darkly, and you let us all think it was me. Margaret's shoulders sagged. The defiance slipped from her like a garment, leaving her small, fragile, and defeated. Miss Ellison, her expression unreadable, folded her hands once more. The truth, once uncovered, can no longer be hidden, and though justice must follow, let us remember, envy and fear are weeds that may take root in any heart, unless guarded by humility and grace. The villagers sat in stricken silence, the shock of revelation settling upon them like the first heavy fall of snow, inevitable, cold, and irrevocable. Chapter 8. Tea After the Storm. Morning broke pale and quiet over Willowbrook, as though the very heavens sought to wash the village clean of its recent troubles. Snow fell in gentle veils, each flake drifting lazily to cloak rooftops and hedgerows in pristine white. Chimneys smoked contentedly, and the rhythmic sound of a milk cart's wheels crunching along the lane brought a reassurance of normal life. At the bakery, Mr. Green busied himself with kneading dough, though his usually hearty chuckles were muted. Customers filed in with lowered voices, their baskets on arms, eager to exchange coin for loaves while slipping in a murmured word or two about Miss Hale's disgrace. "Such a pity," Mrs. Carter whispered, her shawl pulled tightly round her. "Always so proper, always so dependable. And now this." Mr. Green only sighed, sprinkling flour as though it were holy water to quiet gossip. The post office too saw its share of solemnity. Letters and parcels were handed across the counter, but the true currency exchanged was speculation. "I heard," one gentleman confided, "that the poison was rare, something fetched from abroad. Must have cost a pretty penny." "Nonsense," his neighbor countered. "A simple household tonic could serve the same end." And so the whispers circled, feeding themselves, until fact and invention were hopelessly tangled. Yet despite the murmurs, Willowbrook bent itself again to routine. Children dragged sledges through the lanes, laughing as they tumbled in drifts. The smith worked steadily at his forge, hammer striking a rhythm that carried through the frosty air. Even the church bells rang with their usual steadiness, calling villagers to prayers where the vicar, his voice hushed with sadness, urged forgiveness and reflection. Miss Ellison observed all this from her accustomed seat by the window of her cottage, a teacup warm between her palms. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, though the half-formed scarf trailed in a bright line across the arm of her chair. She watched as Mrs. Carter hurried past, as Thomas Pritchard strode with unusually subdued dignity to the Green Man Inn, and as Margaret Hale's cottage windows remained shuttered, dark against the snow. Life in the village was returning, yes, yet a faint shadow lingered. It was not fear, not precisely, but the reminder that even here, beneath the lantern glow and beside the crackle of familiar hearths, human frailty could strike as sharp as any winter gale. Still, there was comfort in the ordinary, in seed cake cooling on the sill, in the rustle of the postman's satchel, in the sight of neighbors exchanging nods though their hearts still bore the weight of shock. And with time, as Miss Ellison well knew, the whispers would soften, the scandal dim, and Willowbrook would once more appear as the picture of peace it longed to be. Yet, dear listener, is it not so that beneath every tranquil surface lies the memory of a storm? The snow might cover tracks, but it cannot erase them. And though cups of tea will once again be poured with laughter, somewhere in the telling of this tale, someone will always recall the one-eyed widow and the fate that ended in darkness. For now, however, Willowbrook rested, blanketed in white, and the village breathed in unison, as if to say, life, no matter how shaken, must carry on. The evening had drawn in softly, bringing with it the hush of snow settling deeper across the fields. Miss Ellison's cottage glowed like a lantern against the gathering dusk, its windows bright with firelight. Within, the air was rich with the scent of tea leaves and a plate of seed cake, its sugary crust just beginning to crisp. The flames in the hearth whispered against the logs, sending flickers of gold across the bookshelves and the delicate china cups laid out on the little oak table. Opposite Miss Ellison sat her dearest companion, Mrs. Hartwell, a plump, cheerful widow whose spectacles always seemed about to slide from her nose. She sipped her tea with a sigh of contentment, though her eyes carried a shadow of unease. "It is difficult to take it in," she murmured, her voice low. "That poor Margaret! Who would have thought her capable of such, well, such wickedness?" Miss Ellison stirred her tea gently, the spoon's soft chime punctuating her pause. "We are all capable, my dear. Envy is a quiet weed, growing in corners unseen. It thrives in places where pride and fear feed its roots. I do not excuse her act, but I cannot say I am astonished either. Too often, the masks we wear simply too convincing for our neighbors to see beneath." Mrs. Hartwell shivered, drawing her shawl close. "It makes one wonder, doesn't it, about everyone we think we know so well. If Miss Hale could harbor such feelings, then who else may? Perhaps all of us," Miss Ellison said softly. "We live together in these little villages, smiling at one another in shops, nodding across pews in church. Yet each person carries a private world within them, filled with desires, regrets, and at times secrets. The charm of village life lies in its closeness, but so too does the danger, for there is no privacy from watchful eyes, and no refuge when jealousy strikes." The clock ticked on, steady and reassuring. Mrs. Hartwell reached for another slice of seed cake, comforted by its familiar sweetness. "I should not like Willowbrook to lose its peace," she said with a faint smile. "We are a village that lives on kindly gossip and jam sales. We are not meant for dark tragedies." Miss Ellison's eyes softened as she looked into the flames. "No, and yet even here, humanity remains what it is, tender and fallible. We cannot remove envy or pride any more than we can halt the snow. But we can, perhaps, meet it with kindness. And when darkness comes, as it did this week, the light of friendship and neighborliness must shine the brighter." A silence followed, but it was not heavy. The fire popped gently, and the snow tapped at the windows like a visitor too shy to knock. Mrs. Hartwell leaned back with a sigh, her features easing at last. "You always make things sound so gentle, Miss Ellison. Even murder." Miss Ellison allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "Life, my dear, is best endured with gentleness and a pot of good tea." They raised their cups together, the clink of china bright in the homely room. Outside, the village lay hushed beneath its snowy quilt, and within, two women shared warmth, reflection, and the quiet certainty that, whatever storms might come, Willowbrook's heart would endure. And so, the tale of the one-eyed widow closed not in sorrow, but in the simple comfort of tea by the hearth, where even the sharpest of secrets softened into memory. And so, dear friends, the mystery of the one-eyed widow has come to its quiet conclusion. Willowbrook, dusted once more with winter's snow, has returned to its familiar rhythms. The postman's whistle, the bakery's warm loaves, the hum of village gossip over steaming cups of tea. Beneath its charm, we glimpsed how pride and envy can twist even the gentlest of hearts, reminding us that human nature, like the seasons, carries both light and shadow. But balance is restored. The hearth glows, the scones rise, and the bells of St. Hilda's ring with steady comfort. Such tales remind us that life, though sprinkled with secrets, is also rich with kindness and companionship. Tell me, had you been at the fete, would you have noticed the faint bitterness in the teacup? Do share your thoughts, and until we meet again, may your evenings be warmed by friendship and just a touch of mystery.